Hello. Welcome back to Corey Hughes' Bloody History. Today we're going to wrap up the Weisberg interview with Philip Boatwright. And I think after this I'm going to try to dig up some more Boatwright stuff. And if it's relevant, we'll cover it. But I'm really itching to get to Philip Geraci. And once we figure out what the deal is with Philip Geraci, we're going to move on to hopefully Martin McAuliffe, Kent Courtney, and what the fuck is his name? Not Bud Simcoe. Clint Bolton. Clint Bolton. So these three guys are definitely CIA. They definitely were all associates of Thornley, seemingly predating the associations with Bannister and whatnot. So was Thornley connected to Bannister and Ferry by these guys because of his resemblance to Lee Harvey Oswald? I don't know. Kind of weird coincidence that Kerry Thornley ended up with these guys, and he happened to look just like Lee Harvey Oswald. Not coincidence. That was definitely intentional. So he had to have been paired with these guys because of his resemblance. I'm trying to think if Kerry Thornley had lived in New Orleans before the Marines, or if he'd always been in Whittier, California, and just went to New Orleans for those 2 years, starting in 1961. That would have been about 2.5 years at that point, because then he left for Arlington, Virginia. But I digress. So this is the interview with Philip Boatwright. Philip Boatwright, another low-level CIA kind of probably trainee, right? Recruit, much like Kerry Thornley. And so Weisberg is questioning him. This is obviously over the telephone. Questioning him about various things about Kerry Thornley. Philip Boatwright, that is. So he asks Philip Boatwright, did he, Kerry Thornley, talk much about his Marine Corps days and Oswald? He never spoke to me of Oswald, except in a letter, which I cannot for the life of me find. I hope you'll keep looking for it. Yes. I took last night off, in fact, to go through things in an attempt to find it. Did you note it in your journal? Well, I don't know. I was just about to. That is why I have all these journals laying out here on the floor. I was trying to go through them. The first two don't have anything about it. What period is covered by the first two? Well, I'll turn this off then. We were talking while the tape is off about your journals, which begin when, in 1964? June 1964 is your first one. Yes. And that was after you broke off your correspondence relationship with Thornley. I believe it was, yes. I believe that the correspondence took place in 1963. It was never extended. The letters, and this is handwritten by Weisberg, the letters have, of course, not been found. Could it have ended entirely in 1963? Could it have gone into early 1964? It could have. Barbara told me the story about your rather strong disappointment over a letter he had written to either the Saturday Evening Post or Time or something like that, approving in the way that Kennedy assassination, and she seems to recall that this was really what caused you to rupture your relationship with him. I do not recall the substance now exactly of the letter letter to the editor that appeared in one of the popular Post look or something. I did see it. How close to the assassination? Oh gosh, I can't tell you. It was no doubt sometime after, but he had written saying that some magazine had notified him that they would print the letter he had written. And it was a long time after that I happened to come across this. I came across it by accident because Kerry and I weren't corresponding at this time. Yes, I just happened to notice that his name was at the end of the letter. That could have been well into 1964. Yes, as I recall, the substance of the letter was contained in the magazine, was that he was objecting to the idea that Oswald was the assassin. I believe he held that Oswald was being framed, but I'm not sure of the exact substance of it. Do you recall any writing from him in which he expressed something less than dismay over the assassination? My impression is that at least he verbalized in the letter's very, very strong dislike for President Kennedy. That I know, and this is what caused me disgust, and I didn't know how to respond to this sort of thing. I'm not so partisan that I could not put up with someone who opposed Kennedy. Obviously, I worked for Kent Courtney, but Courtney never showered the type of verbal abuse on Kennedy that Kerry did. And this was in a letter? Yes. I guess it would have to be. Well, no, it wouldn't have to be, but it's fascinating. It was not until after the assassination. He never spoke to Kennedy in these terms while the president was still alive. He never speaks about Kennedy while the president was still alive, although I know he was not sympathetic to the administration, the Kennedy administration. And then Weisberg writes in something... Thornley was not sympathetic to any, quote, government that I know of. He did not voice to me a preference for others. Something. Question, I do wish you'd really go through your letters and get anything you have from Thornley. Yes, I will. Because dates could be important. Even just the fact of the letters and a postmark could be important. There's one possibility that disturbs me. I threw them away because of this reaction I had. Well, I hope you didn't, regardless of what they say. Now, what I'd like to ask you is this. If you're reluctant to let me have the originals, Xerox them and send me Xeroxes. But then just tell me how much it costs and I'll pay you back. But if you're not reluctant to let me have the originals, register them so there won't be any problem. Then I'll make copies and return them to you. All right. But whichever way... Well, I think I might say, well, if there's any written or printed information that is mine, that is my personal property that I give you or to you on loan, if it is necessary to use it, fine, but under ordinary circumstances. And then there's like an equal sign and then there's nothing else. It would not be used in writing because that's something I feel very strongly about. May I make this suggestion? As an editor that I don't... Yes, that's right. Personal correspondence or correspondence with a writer on anything, I never release it. Right. And over or above that, if it has any value, it should be a literary property. How about if I put it this way? I won't use it. I won't use it under any circumstances. If Mr. Garrison feels that he must, suppose that I ask him to issue you a subpoena for it. The only problem that, because this puts you under compulsion, the subpoena requires it, and I wanted to eliminate even the remote chance of a subpoena. That is one reason why I came here, because it does attract attention, but if any... And then Boatwright says, especially in Omaha. And then Weisberg writes in the column that is, yes, it does attract attention, especially in Omaha, because of the recent case involving Mr. Beckham. Right, Thomas Beckham. Thomas Beckham went to Omaha after the assassination also, right? A bunch of people did. Fred Lee Chrisman was stationed in Omaha. David Christ had gone there. A lot of stuff going on in Omaha. Why? I don't know. Bush even had connections to Omaha. One of these fucking days, I'm going to have to figure out what the fuck was going on in Omaha in the 50s and 60s. Right. However, if at some time in the future it's important to use one of these things to establish where Thornley was or was not on a certain date or something like that, if you prefer, I think he could issue you a subpoena for it. Let's do it this way. You keep the original and send me a Xerox, and that way he can require the subpoena for the court process, which should be whenever possible, be original. Oh, yes, I understand that. Barbara said that he wrote you a postcard from Mexico. Have you found those? Yes, he did. No, I did not find it. I misunderstood her. I told her on the phone, and then here's a note inserted by Mr. Weisberg. It says, I can't read that name. Mrs. Corey's? Mrs. Corey? I don't know. I can't read that. First call me 32168, second call 4168. So he's just clarifying dates of a phone call. I told her on the phone. Oh, he's talking about. Is he talking about Barbara? Where the fuck is it? No. I told her on the phone I had not found it, but that I remembered receiving it because the first time she called, I said she asked me if I had received any correspondence from court, from Thornley mailed outside the United States. I said no, but I got to thinking about it, and I remembered that he had sent me a postcard from Mexico. More selective memory. Apparently from Mexico City. At least the picture on the card was a Mexico City picture. Because it was this famous cathedral. Yes, do you remember the date? No, sir, I do not. But that, again, it may be that I still have it. The date, again, could be very important. It could be important in a way that might exculpate him. I will, certainly, because you see, Oswald was in Mexico at very close to the same time. This would be in '63, before cold weather, when Barbara and I were in the French Quarter. This was the great cry. Everybody was going to Mexico, and very busboys too. Oh, everyone wanted to go to Mexico. How many busboys went there? How many busboys could afford that? Well, very few people that I knew went there at all, but like many things in the Quarter, it was talk. Yes. The lit, that was one of the things that set me apart from those who professed to be writers. You did, of course. Everybody was writing something, but they weren't going to print it yet. It wasn't done yet. On and on and on. They wanted to talk about writing, and my feeling at that time perhaps was overly serious. I don't know. But in any case, I wish to be able to. I wish to work at writing more than talk about it. Yes. Before we leave the subject, let's see if there's anything you can connect the receipt of this postcard with. Anything that happened about the same time that might help orient it in time. Well, I was not living here, but in another apartment. When did you come here? And I can tell you, January 10th, 64 to October 1st, 64. You came here October 1st, 64? That's right. And when did you move to the previous address? Well, probably January 10th, 64? Right. Then it was at that address then that you... Yes, could it have been before that? 63, after you came up here? You recall where you lived before you moved to the place that you went to January 10th? Oh, yes, I will lived on Nicholas Street. Let me pause here for a second, because Weisberg, in this document here, it says, remember, this is a transcript that Weisberg wrote, and then he sent it out to Philip Boatwright for correction, right? So Philip Boatwright corrects it. He obviously either lies to him or got it mistaken. And you see, this fucking guy and his selective memory is unbelievable, right? It says, oh, yes, I lived on Lakewood Street here for a while, and then I lived in the Quarter. But then he corrects it when he gets the transcript. He crosses out Lakewood and writes Nicholas. So then it should say, oh, yes, I lived on Nicholas Street here for a while, and then I lived in, and then he scratched off the Quarter and wrote, looks like Aguila Court, Aguila Court. Well, it could have been in either of these places. Thornley was in Mexico that I know of in 63. Is that right? 63? Summer. Well, that wouldn't figure in this then, would it? Well, it's possible, but my impression is that it was received while I was living down on 31st Street, just a few blocks down the street here, because I have a bulletin board above my desk, and I remember putting it up there as a kind of wry memento, pinning it up on this board when I was down the street. Is that the only place you had a bulletin board? No, it was not. When I was up on Nicholas Street, again, he has Lakewood crossed off. Nicholas Street here, which would be immediately after I returned from New Orleans. That would be January of 63. Until when? Well, I think until Brandy could help you here, because there was until she left Oklahoma to go to Oklahoma City, or to Lawton, Oklahoma, rather, which would be, I think, around May. So do you see how he's kind of deflecting the question, and he's getting Weisberg to go in circles here, right? Anti-interrogation training. Well, I think until Brandy could help you here, because there was until she left for Omaha to go to Oklahoma City, or Lawton, Oklahoma, rather, which would be, I think, around May of 64. No, I'd say of 63. Of 63. If she doesn't remember the receipt of the letter, it would mean that it was after May of 63. Yes, it would indicate that. That's what, which would mean I was... That's what you will find, either down at Aguila Court here in Omaha with a painter friend of mine, or that I was here because I moved directly from the studio to this 31st Street address. The building was... Do you see how he's trying to confuse Mr. Weisberg here? Because at first he received it in 64, right? He got it sometime in 64. Oh, 64, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, but then I got it here. I got it at this time. Oh, 63, not 64. Right, 63. Oh, but he went in May, so it would be after May of 63. Oh, right, it would be after May of 63. Right, so Weisberg is trying to funnel him down to lock in on a fucking specific date, but this guy's all over the place with his selective memory, right? Now, who would have told him to employ this selective memory? Probably one of these common handlers between him and Carrie Thornley, like Clint Bolton or Kent Courtney. Probably not Martin McAuliffe. Remember, these three guys are guys that we're going to have to get to. Another possibility is that the postcard was not mailed from Mexico. You see, now he's confusing him even more. It was a postcard that he picked up one time or another, and because he had this old cathedral, Carey was rather proud of his nationalistic agnosticism, or rationalistic agnosticism. And this church, as you know, was preserved by the revolutionary government in Mexico as a symbol of the oppression of the church. That was the reason he sent it. I've forgotten what the remark he made on it at the other side. Okay, so now he's trying to tell him that, he might have bought the postcard at another time, right? So he's completely trying to obfuscate this timeline. Fucking CIA. But it was a remark appropriate to that. Yes, and it was really quaint. This boy had the complete Ingersoll lectures, for example, in his room. He had almost a 19th century view of the value of rationalism. With Thomas Paine, who said that there's some scripture that the angels give the tablets to him, a prophet, and Thomas Paine said, since I was not there to see this, I have the right to doubt it. This is the kind of view that Carey had. Do you remember anything else that he went into in his letters? What sorts of things did he write about? I don't recall. There was an exchange relative to a poem of mine, a long poem written in New Orleans just shortly before I left, which he liked very much. It has never been published, and he did ask about this poem, and I said, if you want it, why, instead of publishing, I will sell it to you, and you will retain the rights to it and any reprint value that if I should want to put it in a collection sometime, that you will hold the rights to it and you will be credited. And he didn't go for the idea at all, but he did like the poem. To my knowledge, that is the only other thing he talked about. Yes, the poem. Do you recall any references to Kennedy or the assassination? You mean in the letter? Yes. Oh, yes. He was, this kind of, I hesitate to say, because the evidence of the letter, which may turn up letters, there are more than one, I think may be different than my impression. But my impression is that he was glad. And then it says, see page 61 attached. Well, that would not be unique because he and another man, celebrated the assassination. Certainly there was no remorse involved. A little shock in conventional sense. Did he ever refer to Oswald in the letters? Yes, he told me he had been in the Marine Corps with Oswald. He didn't tell you that in New Orleans? Oswald had already defected, you see, and had then come back to the United States. No, he never mentioned Oswald to me. Okay, so let me pause right here. This is kind of funny because in this time in New Orleans in 61 and 62 and 63, that Carey Thornley's down there, he obviously knows of Philip Boatwright for that 8 or 9 month period. I forget if it's 62 or 61 or 60. It had to have been 62. So he knew him for that 8 or 9 month period. And at this time, Carey Thornley is writing The Idle Warriors, or so he's telling Garrison. And if it's by summer of 62, he's already met with fucking Martin McAuliffe and Joyce Talley and all these guys, right? All these fucking CIA people. Guy Bannister, he's getting plugged in with them by summer of 62, right? And I think summer 62 is about the time when Philip Boatwright's living in New Orleans. So, therefore, he's telling me he never mentions Oswald, but he's writing the fucking book about Oswald. So this doesn't make any sense. He's his best friend, the closest guy to him in New Orleans, and he never mentions to him that he's writing this fucking book on Oswald ever? Bullshit. No, he never mentioned Oswald to me. Oswald was back in the United States when you knew Thornley in New Orleans. It's possible. It seems to me that Carey would not have thought noteworthy to mention Oswald. He was writing a book, allegedly. Not on Oswald, though. Absolutely. At the time I knew him? Absolutely. Before the assassination. The book is called The Idle Warriors. Yes, I remember the name. And he has here, you mentioned it many times, but then he mentioned it many times, corrected above it. But I never saw the manuscript, but very few people did. Well, he was always going to show it to me, but he kept revising it. Everybody says the same thing, but he didn't tell you what the book was about, didn't say it was about a guy he knew in the Marine Corps who defected to the Soviet Union. Oh, yes, he did. Yes. That was Oswald, the guy he knew in the Marine Corps who defected to the Soviet Union. Well, I don't know that he said it that way, but he did say it was about the Marine Corps. That I remember. Yes. Could be, of course, and then something is redacted, okay? Is parentheses, redacted in it. Why the fuck is this redacted? Earlier, but yes, I remember him saying that, but he never mentioned, to my knowledge, my recollection now, anything about Oswald directly. That is his name. He never mentioned the name? Nor did he mention anything more about his book. Did he get it published? Except that it was after the assassination he told somebody with whom he lived in New Orleans that he'd been offered a fantastic sum for the final chapter by NBC but wouldn't sell it. From your knowledge, the way you're laughing is enough of an answer for me, isn't it? He didn't mention anything of this kind to me. No, that's not what I meant. In this keeping with the Thornley you knew, is this keeping with the Thornley you knew? That he would have turned down a large sum of money for a chapter of an unpublished book from a major media element like NBC? No. He had Randian view towards money. It was a glorious thing to obtain money, and he would have certainly sold it. That's my impression, that is. That's my impression, too. But I'm also suggesting that if he had serious intentions as a writer to be used on NBC would give him a certain status. I think that would appeal to him much more. Both of these things would have appealed to him. In fact, that was my first impression when I read this note in the newspaper that he was, I didn't know he was in Tampa, but that he was going to be brought back to New Orleans, or he might be brought back to New Orleans for trial. And then Weisberg says, I tried to help him on that. He couldn't be helped. I went to see Clint Bolton. Do you know Clint Bolton? I don't recall him. So right now we have a direct denial of knowing Clint Bolton from Philip Boatwright. Okay? Make a mental note of that. It's going to be important. I don't recall him. He was getting along in years. He has the reputation of being an alcoholic. He was part of the Chicago newspaper group in the 30s. He worked for Reuters for a while, and he now has the record concession of a Dixieland Hall. He acted as Thornley's agent. The dedication of Thornley's book may interest you. To Clint Bolton, who first told me, "Go home, you bum, and write." I tried to suggest to him that Thornley would be inevitably considerable interest to him and Jim Garrison following my own work on Thornley, which was published, that it was only a question of time before Garrison got to him, and that if Thornley were wise, he would get together with me and we would talk. If he were not quite that wise, he would still take the initiative and get in touch with Garrison. He went involuntarily. He did it in a very inept way. He went to court without a lawyer, and the judge said, "Go," and so he went. And I have no doubt that he lied. I have no doubt whatsoever that he lied, which was a crazy thing to do. Incidentally, Barbara says that you told her that you could imagine Thornley wanting to be. I was just going to say I think he was going to have enjoyed the whole thing. Do you think he would have enjoyed going to jail? Well, I think that he initially might regard it as something that might have to be put up with rather than compromise his principles. His principles to me are very bizarre, but do you think he has a principle of, and then parentheses, false swearing, to be a liar? No, I don't. I really don't. In fact, when you mentioned this thing about selling, this thing about the offer to buy the last chapter, that struck me as odd. And then there's a note here. Yes, I doubt that Carey would be, and then I can't read that, his specific objective justified this means. I don't know what that means. And the question is, it struck me as odd too. Garrison's office believed it. That is why I make a point of it, because if it told who killed the president, they'd have every reason to believe he's an honest man. But could this be the kind of bizarre thing he would have invented? Not regarding it personally as a lie, but having other objective by it. Oh, that I wouldn't know. Thornley made, well, if there wasn't, what other objective could he possibly have? I just don't know. If there were, yes, he would lie because he believed that the end was justified by the means. Yes, he believed that very strongly. Do you suppose that he could translate this into his political life? I'm sure that he did. That's one of the reasons we as personalities never developed into friends, even when I was in New Orleans. That's why I say he was like Thomas Paine in the sense that he was vitriolic. Okay, so now, despite the fact that previously we have Philip Boatwright and Carey Thornley both acknowledging that they were each other's closest friends during the time that Philip Boatwright was there. Now we have Philip Boatwright saying, when asked if Carey Thornley is used lying as justified his lying as part of his political life, he says, "I'm sure that he did. That's one of the reasons we as personalities never developed into friends, even when I was in New Orleans." That's why I say he was like Thomas Paine in the sense that he was vitriolic. Okay, so they never developed into friends, but even though he moved out of New Orleans to Omaha, they continued to write letters to each other at multiple addresses. Okay? It doesn't make any sense at all. It only makes sense when you realize that these guys are both low-level operatives. Believed in polemic, and it didn't necessarily have to be true if it achieved the end that he had in mind. That's my understanding of his belief in polemics. And then in parentheses it says, that is the art of persuasion, slanting of information as opinion to present as strong case as possible. Yes, do you think he could be associated with CIA-type activity? And Philip Boatwright goes, I haven't any idea what CIA activities are other than that they're espionage. Which is funny because he was working for Kent Courtney writing propaganda, right? Working for the fucking CIA. This fucking asshole. Well, I don't mean that. Would he be direct employee of the CIA? And that's why I phrased it indirectly. From what you know of his character and of his beliefs, do you believe that either one could lead him to affiliate himself with activities that the CIA sponsored rather than did himself? No, I have no evidence. Not one way or the other. One way or the other. My impression is that he would never, under no circumstance, if he knew that the government were involved, he would not associate himself with the government because he felt that the government were a bunch of socialists. Do you mean just the Kennedy government or any government? Well, the Kennedy government was the government at that time. And then he asks, well, suppose the approach to him would be that he would be opposing this type of activity in the government. This is hypothetical. Suppose that from what you know of his political beliefs, it were presented to him as something that would be counter to the government's policies on Cuba. Because you may remember in those days, there was a detente. You were in New Orleans at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yes. Barbara was uncertain whether it was the Bay of Pigs, which she first thought, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was right after you moved there. Do you remember anything he might have said about that by way? That was in October. No, I don't. Toward the end of October 62 was when it was settled. It was announced there on the 15th of October. Oh, really? Well, then I was still working. That would establish that I was a little more clearly my period of employment with Kent because I was working on the Independent American when President Kennedy blockaded Cuba because that is what cost me my job so far as I know. Your attitude? No. The Conservative Society of Americans set up this convention arrangement for Chicago, and their big pitch was they were going to have Congressman Rousselot, Rousselot, from California, and have someone from Miami. Their big pitch was that we should put an iron ring around Cuba. I have a copy around here someplace of a radio speech that was in the campaign because I wrote it. And then, so let me stop right here. So Kent Courtney is a propagandist who obviously works for the fucking CIA. Because you have to remember, go back to Goebbels' principles of propaganda. Propaganda must be controlled by a centralized source. In America, that centralized source is the CIA. Okay? Therefore, this fucking guy was working for Kent Courtney, who was putting out propaganda, working for the CIA, who denies he was working for the CIA, but now he's acknowledging that he's putting out anti-Castro propaganda. This doesn't make any fucking sense at all to you people. It should make perfect sense because then the key to this, the cipher by which to decipher Mr. Boatwright's answers here, is obviously through the lens of fucking intelligence. What kind of a person from Florida? A Cuban? That is my impression, but I'm not sure. I may have his name. Do you have your files of the Independent American for that period? Oh, yes. This is, and then it was volume in parentheses. And it says, of your work at Courtney's? Yes. How complete is it? It's hard to say. But this starts with the blockade in Cuba. Yes. Now, you see, there's another interest that these things have. We were talking earlier about the Cuban style, and then it would also indicate whether other things about Courtney. So this is why I say I would like to borrow it and go through it. And of course, I would return it, and that would save time now. Well, I'll tell you what. I will return it insured. Well, why don't see if you could distinguish between what's personal and what doesn't have his personal. And then it says tape ran out here because this is being recorded. Tape 2, side 1, marked 3. This is a draft, assuming it picks up right where it left off. This is a draft, yes. Kent Courtney, the conservative side of the news. Yes, that was the name of the radio broadcast. I don't know whether that ever went on the air or not, but that's, now here is a worksheet detailed 11 SPET, I'm assuming it's September. It says Kent's California speech there. I don't recall precisely what that had to do with, but presumably he was going to California for something. Well, I have other drafts and rewrites here, but they're not dated. Well, what Kennedy knew about Cuba could be of interest. I'm sorry, what Courtney knew. What Courtney knew. Well, are there any copies of the paper there? Yes, then it's interesting. This is the initial one. You notice this one headline there about the announcement of the, and then something is redacted. And then Weisberg asks, Chicago? Yes, right after that was printed, the administration blockaded Cuba and caused it. What did Courtney do then? Well, the convention collapsed. They had no reason. That was their big thing. Then there's a bunch of stuff I can't read. Yes. In fact, that is why they cut back on staff on the newspaper, and that is, or at least that is the reason given me. In short, they cut me off. I was the youngest staff member during my length of employment, I think is what it says. Yes, in short, there's the revised one. They put out another issue of the same new paper. And here they called the blockade a cruel hoax. Yes, again, it had some bearing on the time I was working there. That is dated the 29th or something, isn't it? Yes. Well, I was there when that was produced. Now, the interesting thing is that when Courtney got what he wanted, he wasn't satisfied. Well, that is true of groups of this kind. Even more interesting to me is this Mr. Boatwright, that assuming that the reason he gave you for letting you go is true, it means that really what he was doing was spending money and focusing on Cuba. He had a great interest in Cuba, great enough to spend money on it and to hire people for. Once Cuba was blockaded, he cut back. This is just what you said, he cut back. Well, I think that is the explanation he gave me. I have no reason to think that he ever lied to me. In fact, he is an extraordinary man. He just believes it. Yes, to my knowledge, he believes everything he told me. He was very candid. I think you should know some of the best help I've gotten has been from conservatives, some of them even more conservative than him. I suspect that one man who has done some fine work is a member or connected with the Ku Klux Klan. This is his country too. So I can understand that these people can have these strange, at least they are strange to me, and yet be sincere. However, I just can't understand at the moment why Mr. Courtney would focus on Cuba and then with the blockade of Cuba lose his interest. Well, I think that a good bit of money, this is just projection, I don't know, but I think that a good bit of money was spent on the organization of this convention in Chicago, and when the reason for the convention was pulled out from under him, whose money? Well, I don't know. He had the newspaper. He didn't care if he sold the newspaper especially. He would sell it, but it could only have amounted to a very small recompense. I can't read the notes in the column. Well, where did his money come from? Contributions? Contributions. Did he get that many? He led me to believe there were people who contributed considerable sums. Who they were, I do not know. This is why. The considerable sums part is the only part that can keep this sort of thing going. The individual dollar would have to come in such astronomical numbers that you can't figure on it, and I have often wondered where his money did come from. I don't know. And I often wonder if some of it was federal in ultimate origin. Well, I don't know. But at the time I left, he was having problems with the tax people. They are not the kind of people who give out money. Well, no, but they did run the foundations for students, for instance. They were putting the squeeze on him for income tax for a considerable amount. Yes. The organization said he didn't. I don't know how this came out. But I know that I was told that he regarded this as some kind of government conspiracy to silence him, which is in keeping with his general theme. The only other great issue with Kent at that time was what he regarded as the federal occupation of Mississippi. General Walker. And this is the thing which we came very close to having words about, because to a northerner, it was too much for me to swallow the racism bit. However, I didn't say anything, but he could hardly go to a convention in Chicago with this platform. I was aware of that. I had to be something international or national, or it had to be something international or national, which would appeal to people outside the Deep South, and Cuba was it. And when this collapsed, surely you know there are many organizations of this kind. Their existence depends on being outside, on being the kibitzer, on being the criticizer. When they get what they were talking about wanting, then the reason for their existence collapses. And this was my impression. Do you have any idea why he fixed on Cuba? No, sir, I do not. That was the big thing when I came to work there, and I had very elementary orientation, I am afraid, on the policies. I learned a great deal while I was there. I read like a maniac in an attempt to catch up, and do you ultimately have any idea who some of these large sources of money could ultimately be traced back to? No, sir. They never gave you any indication? No, sir. The mail was all processed by 2 or 3 women that had a little office-like arrangement, a front room. This was a converted home. Who else worked for him that you can recall? Well, let's see. There was, you mean editorially? Anyway, in any capacity. These are not signed by and large except by those by Phoebe or Kent. You've never seen, they're most likely taken from other newspapers. Yes, but there was a woman by the name of Mary Helen. Her last name escapes me, but she occasionally signed an article. Yes, here it is. Melly Heron Brinkle, or Bringle. Wasn't she an assistant editor? Yes, right. Very large woman. Mrs. Bringle, something, something, something. That's the only person I can really tell because that's in the same office, in the same room with me. My impression was that others, they were all women, they opened the mail. Is there anything you could add to the essence of what, pardon me, they opened the mail? Yes. The essence of what Barbara told me is that the Courtneys undertook the defense of General Walker over that incident, raised money and arranged for the lawyer and so forth. That's what Kent told me, that he had seen to it that Walker received a lawyer. Okay, so now what do we have? We have Kerry Thornley and his shenanigans. Let's put them aside. But he's got this relationship with Philip Boatwright. Philip Boatwright is working for Kent Courtney, who's obviously a right-wing, anti-Castro-Cuban, anti-Castro kind of guy who is definitely working with CIA. Because remember, all propaganda comes from a centralized source. So here we're seeing now that there's a connection between Kent Courtney and General Walker and Dallas. Interesting, right? Seemingly more parallel connections to Dallas. The essence of what Barbara told me, that the Courtneys undertook the defense of General Walker over that incident, raised money and arranged for the lawyers and so forth. That's what Kent told me that he had seen to it that Walker's received a lawyer. How about his bond? Man had arranged for that. I believe that. I don't know if Kent or Phoebe put up the money themselves or whether they got somebody to do it or what, but it was a considerable amount of money, wasn't it? I don't know how much money it was. Barbara's recollection is that it came to a tidy sum by the time it was all done. But they, the Conservative Society of America, that is, wished at the time to back General Walker as the CSA candidate for president, much as they had Strom Thurmond and Orville Faubus a few years preceding. They were in touch with General Walker. I've even seen his letters. Poor fellow, has a very poor command of the English language. Walker? Yes, his letters were handwritten. You mean his letters to Courtney? Yes, they all bore the engraved Edwin Walker, U.S. Army, resigned at the top of the stationery, but they were undecided. And they had sent him a copy of a book called 10 Days in May. Kent and Phoebe did. Is that Fletcher Nebel? Yes. And wished to receive his response to this and to this book in order to decide from that whether or not he was worth the backing or not. I have not read the book. Okay, so I just need to cover this one more time. Okay, so now we have absolute proof of parallel connections between Kent Courtney and Edwin Walker, who are obviously friends, because Kent and Phoebe, who's obviously Kent's wife, sent Walker a book and he arranged lawyers for him. They were obviously connected. And who works for Kent Courtney? Well, besides Philip Boatwright, you have Kerry Thornley acknowledging his connection to Kent Courtney. So you have these fucking parallel connected. These aren't even parallel anymore. They're like an oval. They're like an oval that are looped together, right? They're not even parallel because they're connected on both ends. Ooh. This is the stuff that gets me out of bed in the morning. All right, so let's keep moving on. This is fucking amazing stuff here. I hope you can see, while it seems subtle, while it seems background, it seems irrelevant, it's totally fucking not. And it shows the depths of the people on the outskirts of the assassination. Like, was Kent Courtney involved in the assassination? Probably fucking not, really. But was Clint Bolton? Or Bud Simcoe? Possibly, way more possibly. Bud Simcoe, if that's a real fucking person at all. Then yes, I'm pretty convinced, sure. But Kent Courtney obviously connected to this whole right-wing establishment, which is all CIA, and one day I'm going to have to get into Army intelligence and figure out what the fuck their role is. All right, so let me continue. Yes, they all bore the engraved Edwin A. Walker, U.S. Army resigned at the top of the stationery, but they were undecided, and they had sent him a copy of a book called 10 Days in May. Is that Fletcher Nebel? Yes. And wished to receive his response to this and to this book in order to try to decide from that whether or not he was worth the backing or not. I have not read the book. Did you ever see him in your office? No, not to my knowledge. He never visited there. Never indicated that he had visited there. Kent never indicated he had ever visited there. By the way, are you figuring on eating anytime soon or anything? Oh, if you like. But how about you? Well, I haven't eaten since this morning. Well, let me ask you. I made a few notes. Now, there's one thing Barbara wanted me to check with you because you may find this rather unusual way of interviewing, but really all I want is the truth. This is why I'm up all the time. I'm sorry I'm not more precise. That's all right. If you are more precise, then you are accurate. It does me no good. Well, I'm afraid that's what I'm afraid of. That, and then there's some notes here I can't fucking read. That's one reason I always want you to use a tape. Not to even trust my own memory. She had told me about a uniformed group she thought were Civil Air Patrol cadets. They wore uniforms. They had a blue truck. They had an insignia. They hung around a theater. Ooh, they hung around a theater. She initially thought that was New Orleans, but she wondered if it could have been something in Omaha, in New Orleans, that could connect with David Ferry. Nothing that I've observed. You don't know anything about it in Omaha? No. She told me to check on that with you. She told me over this over the phone when she told me she'd spoken to you because she'd been thinking about it and wanted to be more certain in her own mind. Did Barbara ever tell you how she met Thornley? No. And then there's a note. Let me see if I can read it. It says, not that I can recall, but the very likely did tell. Whatever. Okay, question. I don't remember asking her. I'll ask her. I'm not sure that she met him first, but I think she introduced me to him. Okay, let's analyze that sentence. I'm not sure that she met him first, but I think she introduced him to me. That sentence contradicts itself. More anti-interrogation training. That's what you said earlier. I don't remember where I first saw him. Much like Thornley, who doesn't remember where he first met Oswald, right? Just kind of came into his consciousness. I don't remember where I first saw him. Barbara said you found a copy of The Innovator. I'd very much like to borrow that. I carry it. I have it with me, in fact. This is Thornley's address in Los Angeles. That's very good. What's the date? April 9th, 1963. Can we leave it with your Courtney file? Yes. Now this is not a letter. It's not from Thornley. It's a sample copy of this thing, The Innovator. Thornley did not address it. Not to my knowledge, no. Okay, let's just keep it all in the envelope in which it came. It does in one of the, and then something's redacted here, of the back issues, there are things listed that he supposedly had written, one of them called Comrade Oswald and the Holy God and Mankind. Thornley wrote that? That is what it says. This is very important, Mr. Boatwright. Down at the bottom there, Do you know if Thornley knew that Oswald got communist literature openly in the Marine Corps? Let me keep it all together and we'll spend what time we have together. I'll read that separately. Would you mind putting it in the envelope so we'll keep it all together and I'll keep it that way for you? I'll return all of this. Oswald got communist literature openly in the Marine Corps, and Thornley knew that he had at least a secret security clearance. You can be pretty apolitical and know that these things are incompatible. Yes. Thornley knew that Oswald almost broke with him when he implied that Oswald was a communist, and Thornley's words are, "Not you too, Thornley. Oswald was a strong anti-communist, Mr. Boatwright, and Thornley was used by the Warren Commission to establish Oswald as a communist. Not another one of his Marine Corps buddies would do it. It got to the point with one Sergeant Delgado where the lawyer didn't realize that what he was doing when he described Oswald's favorite book, The Animal Farm, as an anti-communist classic. And then you can see, oops, just jumping right off the page, and then they go on to something else." That's funny. I can't imagine Carey, at least as I knew him, of course. I didn't know Carey when he was in the Marine Corps, and I don't know how recent his conservative rightist views were. It was in the Marine Corps. But anyone who was a communist, as a professed communist, would not endear themselves to Thornley at a time I knew him. Thornley would hardly have been a friend of his. No, he was extremely rightist. As I say, he was more of the Courtney type. Of course. Well, you'll learn more about Oswald in my book, Oswald in New Orleans, and I'll leave all four of them. Do you remember anything I asked you, and you don't remember anything he ever mentioned about Oswald by way of delineating Oswald's character? To my recollection, he never mentioned it. That was in New Orleans. He did mention him in the letter, which I have yet to uncover. Barbara mentioned that you had correspondence with Al Thompson, Al Scott, Pat Patterson, and Mim. No, that's incorrect. You knew Mim. I knew all of these people. You had no correspondence with them? None of them. There are some, that is, to Thompson, for example. I write to when I returned to Omaha, but I received no reply. Al Scott was the bartender at the Bourbon House. Thompson was kind of somebody who came around. Mim was a painter of sorts. Patterson, the same thing. Patterson, a painter? Yes. Driver? Driver. He was a driver too? Did he lose part of an ear? Not to my knowledge. That's a different Patterson then. This fellow had almost albino colored hair. Patterson? Yes. Naturally? So far as I know. Now, Al Scott, can you imagine Al Scott organizing a group that called itself Services Unlimited and saying, we will do anything for a price? Because he did. And I'm wondering if it was a frivolity or something serious. Some of the men associated with that went around and were talking for a while about their getting an offer to kill the president, and I think they're a little bit unhappy about it now. I'm satisfied that no such thing happened, but I think they wish they hadn't said it. Well, again, here I hesitate to. I hardly know how you could weigh it. I don't like the guy very much. I did write to him once after I'd returned to New Orleans to me because he was an extremely forceful experience, and to this day I'm interested in what took place there, when I was there at least. It's a forceful city to me, and I wanted to maintain a link with it, so I wrote to such people as Thompson, hoping that I would at least get some news or something. Did you say Thompson or Scott? Thompson. Al Scott, I did not know. Didn't know if he was still bartending, and because the way I understood it, he was returning to his hometown with his wife or something. I think he's from Detroit. Yes, by this Al, you mean Al Scott. So, I see what you mean. Yes, I'm thinking the person I dislike was Al Thompson. He's the person I wrote to. I wrote to Latham, Vic Latham, mentioned earlier. Thornley, I believe, so far as I know, had left the quarter. I think he said he was going to Whittier or someplace. This was after you left? Yes, shortly after I left. So, Philip Boatwright left to go back to Omaha before Carey Thornley left for Whittier in May of 63. Okay. Then maybe I ought to tell you that 2 weeks after the assassination, Carey Thornley went to Arlington, Virginia, and stayed there through all the hearings of the Warren Commission. You told me earlier you had testified that he was a witness. Yes, but he moved to where they were working to become a doorman at the Shirlington house. Somehow that sounds like him. He wanted to be on the scene. Yes. Again, I ask you, you see why I asked the question before, is what you know of him consistent with him wanting to be associated with affairs he thought might be of moment and might be in consonance with his own beliefs as he saw them? Why should he want to leave the quarter? He was happy there, wasn't he? Yes, however, life in general, didn't have much of an edge there. What do you mean by not having much of an edge? People are kind of non-political? And he goes, everything is manama, manana, M-A-N-A-N-A, mañana, tomorrow. Everything is mañana, tomorrow. Oh, not necessarily. Well, I don't know anything about it, really. Politics in the quarter, except for Kent, and he doesn't live in the quarter. Well, people in the quarter that I knew anyway, I knew most all of them, but those I knew were not overtly interested in politics. We're not declaimers. We're not intense people. They're more or less lethargic. They would not do a thing today if they could put it off till tomorrow. Thornley was not, in my opinion, like that. Of course, he was not native to the area. He was a Californian. He wasn't native to Arlington, Virginia, which is Washington. And you find even moral lethargy there. Most of the seat of government people are not as inclined to criticize government. So in my own thinking, and it's only thinking, I have no specific knowledge, I think he went there to be near the Warren Commission. It's quite possible, quite possible. Kerry is an activist of a kind, a political activist of a kind, and at least verbally. He is not, however, an intellectual. I know, clearly he's not. Did you ever walk around during the day with him or at night? Did you ever go into a post office with him? No, not that I can recall. The post office that's on Camp, the old post office opposite Lafayette Square on Camp Street. Yes, Lafayette Square is where the Times-Picayune used to be. No, they just moved. Well, the only post office in New Orleans that I visited was the branch that's in the quarter. Yes. Now I'm asking you if you ever went there with Thornley. No, I went there alone. Did you ever know of him having a post office box? Thornley, you never addressed him at a post office box at any place? No, he was in Los Angeles 3 years ago. Now suppose I wanted to get in touch with Mim. Do you remember her last name? No, I do not. Her husband was a pilot, I believe, Barbara said. Oh, yes, that's been many, many years ago. How old are they? Well, she's maybe 40 to 45. She was living alone when I knew her. I mean, when we knew her in New Orleans. She spoke of having a husband, whether or not there was a divorce or whether they simply parted. You never knew her husband? No, I didn't. I guess it was Barbara who told me her husband had been a pilot. I think he may have been. Mim was a pilot, an aviatrix herself. All right. So it looks like we got about 15 pages to go or so. I don't feel like wrapping it up today. We're going to wrap it up tomorrow. So good stuff. Good stuff, right? We're making some more connections between New Orleans and Dallas through Kent Courtney to General Walker. Of course, we all know the General Walker story. We all know it was William Seymour. And so, okay, here's another interesting one. So now we've got the connection from Kerry Thornley to Kent Courtney to General Walker. And from General Walker, we have the correct connection directly to Lauren Hall, to William Seymour, who's the one who, William Seymour and Lawrence Howard, who are the ones who shot at Walker's house, right? I love it. These connections they're congealing. But that's it for today, guys. Tune in tomorrow. If you haven't picked up my book, please go to Amazon.com, pick up my book. You can also go to buymeacoffee.com/JFK book. There's a slew of stuff you can buy there. You can buy my personal notes and blah, 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 and all that good shit. So that's going to do it for today, and I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks, guys.